Hello and welcome back to another episode of From the Field. I'm your host, Casio. I am a solution architect based in Wellington, New Zealand. And quite aptly, after following Howdy Partner, which is the show that precedes us, we have another partner on the Twitch show that is going to go over compliance, which is normally people think of boring, but in my opinion, it's quite exciting. And what I do not enjoy about compliance, so is when you have to prove your compliance to the external party, and that will eat up a significant portion of your life. And if you live in the fintech industry, you'll find that quite often you have to do it yearly or whenever you bring on a new customer, especially banks and insurance agencies. They really, really want to make sure that you are compliant. And it's a very repetitive process, let's just say, and it gets old after the first time. Chamila, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Yes, thanks, Casey, for having me. My name is Chamila. I'm an AWS Senior Cloud Architect at Levin. So I've been living in New Zealand for about 4 years now. I'm originally from Sri Lanka. I've been doing IT for close to a decade and a half. Been a developer for close to a decade, doing coding in a lot of business domains, healthcare, search, and I've also worked for a long stretch in open source, especially in enterprise middleware. So I did actually love working with XML for a while. So I do have, I'm into open source a lot. I did have Apache PMC membership until last year, I think, until it expired. I've been working with AWS for about 8 years now, and finally decided I'll just commit to being an AWS cloud architect.
Nice.
So
I was actually just saying, before you continue, like you mentioned XML, and that brought back the days of my SOAP XML contracts.
oh yeah. So XML, WSDL, access to those have been my kind of bane of existence for for a few years. But yeah, we did actually transition into a more modern stack after a while.
Eventually, there's still more than enough XML out there to fill everyone's boots.
Yeah.
So, what got you into the whole compliance space? Like, why are you talking about now?
Yeah, so that's an interesting topic because I've filled a lot of roles in my past lives. I've been an SRE lead, a cloud lead, and also in the current role that I'm filling in, I'm also working through some compliance requirements as well. So most of the time that I've worked with these efforts, I've noticed that there is kind of a disconnect between the language information compliance, information security speaks, and the language that us engineers speak. So I want to see if I can bring some clarity into this discussion and see if I can bridge the gap these two thinking patterns have. Um, so
I do.
see.
I do want to ask one other question. How long does it normally take you to achieve or like get all of the information and work yourself through one of these compliance frameworks, like to an Excel
Yeah,
audit?
usually your information security team will have done most of the legwork already when it comes to when the discussion comes to you, right? If you're an engineer, you'll probably have to only provide evidence for most of the controls that information security has pointed towards you. But in my experience, it has been at least a few weeks of calls with the auditors, external auditors who are trying to make sense of the solution as well as the landscape at the same time. So at least a couple of weeks in my experience for me.
And that'll be all driven through the hidden underbelly of decision making within the businesses, which be spreadsheets, right?
Exactly. So I did promise that there'll be no spreadsheets in this talk, but I'll try to I'll try to keep spreadsheets out of the talk. But yeah, unfortunately, there's going to be you'll almost always see this huge spreadsheet that manages the level of control validation almost, right? So yeah, I want to briefly touch on an area that checks if we can make a dent on that practice. But yeah, let's see.
Yeah, and ideally make it a little bit more repeatable. So once you've gone through the pain, once you can, kind of templatize it for the most part, and then
Yeah,
just answer the variations of the architecture. Sweet.
exactly.
So I'm going to hand this over to you, Jamila, and if you just want to go for it, I'll share your screen now.
Right. So, just a quick slide on my employer. So I'm part of Levin, and Levin is part of the Spark Business Group. And if you already have a relationship with Spark, if you want to build a relationship with Spark when building your cloud solution, see if you can talk to us, see if we can provide some value to you. Um, so, as I said, the main motivations for me to do a talk on this topic was the disconnect we had between these two thinking patterns. And auditors almost always focus their thinking, as I've seen, on the on-premise side of things, and the language around the guidelines are almost always focused around on-premise activities. And I can see that there is some confusion even with industry standards that are geared towards the cloud. Uh, when it comes to concrete implementations such as AWS, editors still have some confusion on concepts like shared responsibility model, or even with the shared responsibility model, the level of nuances that are there for different services such as Lambda functions, right? And also the the two thinking patterns that the engineers and information security has, these are different views into the same solution. So I want to see if we can bring some clarity with AWS services involved, so that there is a common language that can be spoken when these interactions happen. And also, like we said, we want to see if we can change. We can move away from spreadsheets. A quick introduction to the compliance landscape as of right now. So you have the typical industry standards that you should go through: ISO 27001, or business domain specific ones like PCI DSS or HIPAA. But then you'd also have some country level regulation that you'll have to adhere to. So I'm based in New Zealand, so I can take, for an example, New Zealand Information System Security Manual. But depending on where you are, there'll always be country level, country specific regulation that you'll have to check on for compliance. So for an example, for USA, there's the federal level guidelines for cybersecurity management, if I remember that title correctly, NIST SP 800. And then there's always going to be some cloud risk assessment work that has to be done, especially if your client is a government client. This cloud risk assessment work is usually focused around bringing the agency's attention to the risks, to a risk-based thinking when it comes to using the cloud itself. And then you'd have your organization specific controls if your organization is seeking certification for different standards, and then you'll also have any controls provided to you by the clients as business requirements. So let's talk about cloud security. So we have seen this statement, right? I mean, I get that this is a joke. It's not the cloud; it's someone else's computer. But again, it's technically the truth. But I have some gripe about it. So yes, it's someone else's computer, but you're always going to have some responsibility and also some control over what you're doing in someone else's computer. So we can separate this responsibility into two categories: security of the cloud and then security in the cloud. And these two responsibilities are between the cloud service provider and the cloud service customer. So I'm going to use these two phrases, CSP, CSC, frequently in the next set of slides. So these two mean cloud service provider and the cloud service customer, which is going to be used. So the cloud service provider in our case is going to be AWS. So let's jump into security of the cloud. This is entirely the responsibility of the cloud service provider, AWS, and the typical concerns here are about the data center security, the physical device security, or the separation of data and the compute processes between different tenants that are utilized in the cloud. And also then you have other concerns like availability, business continuity, and all the other requirements that come in for good architecture, right? So if you're an auditor looking to validate any control that might fall on the side of security of the cloud, chances are you'll be able to find evidence in a service called AWS Artifact. So let's just briefly look at AWS Artifact. Now, this is not a service per se, in my opinion. This is a document repository that contains all the agreements between the client, that will be you and AWS, any specific country-wide regulation that you'll have to agree to based on your location, and also other reports such as third-party evaluations done on AWS, certifications that AWS has achieved, and any additional workbooks that you'll have to work on based on the level of compliance you have to achieve. So this is something you typically see when you log into your account. The only requirement here is you just have an AWS account. But for an example, if you're looking for SOC 2 reports, it's pretty easy to download from here and provide to the auditors. So if you as an auditor are looking for something more specific, if for an example, if you're looking to see if you can perform a third-party evaluation on AWS, it's probably out of the question. But if you're looking for more specific details that are not in AWS Artifact, you might probably be able to find them if you talk to your technical account manager, for an example.
And just to jump in there, for the security of the cloud, one of the differentiators for AWS is the Nitro card system within our virtual layer. And I believe there was a third-party study that was just released this year, and there's also an AWS white paper that was released November last year. And that's a really cool system that I don't believe that we really do enough to promote. And it does a lot to elevate that security between the multi-tenants. So I'd highly recommend everyone, like, if you are bored and have some time to spare, to actually read those. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen a lot of questions on this area as well because again, because of the implication that it's someone else's computer, auditors always seem to have this reservation. Okay, how do you actually make sure that these things are followed? So yeah, something like that would be really helpful. So jumping into the other side of the responsibility, security in the cloud. Now, this is going to be on you as a customer that uses the cloud service. So this is where the cool stuff come in as engineers, right? So you think about secure architecture, you think about how to establish a secure configuration, and you might already have a landing zone template that is built upon best practices that you have learned throughout your work. But it might be also be a good idea to establish a kind of a project template that can be readily used for any new projects that you're going to take on as well. Now, this template can have considerations such as how to use infrastructure as code, or your arsenal of infrastructure as code, and how to make sure that good code is being committed, how to do version controlling, how what kind of practices to follow when it comes to code reviews, details like that. And also, like, a good example is static code analysis. It's really good to have these in your CI/CD pipelines from the start, because these are the questions that you'll get when it comes to process side of controls. And it's really recommended. I can't recommend enough that you have these from the get-go, from the early stages of implementation, because the later you try to introduce this, there'll be a lot of change management that you'll have to do within your project team as well. And also, when it comes to change management process, you should have a defined path to production. You should have a process that clearly says this is how you would propagate changes to production. And again, have this from the get-go. For the architects who will be doing a bunch of the work here, I mean, you're very well aware of the well-architected tool. You've probably done well-architected framework reviews. And another tool that I found during research was AWS Compliance Center. Now, Compliance Center is another document repository, I should say, that is really helpful, especially if your solution is around financial industry. If you're worried about the level of regulation that you'll have to meet, if you're worried about any government regulation that you'll have to consider, this is a good place to go to and check based on the country that you're operating on. Now, for an example, Sri Lanka and New Zealand are the two countries that I'm most familiar with, so that I put those as examples. But any country that AWS is in business with is listed in AWS Compliance Center. So you can get an idea about the legal entities that are involved in the financial regulation. You can get an idea about the acts that you might have to consider, and also the compliance programs. Now, for these compliance programs, there'll be a level of applicability involved, but again, it's important that you have an idea about this, not necessarily try to comply to every program when you're trying to implement. So consider checking AWS compliance at the early stages of your architecture work. Right. So shared responsibility models. Now, if you're an engineer, this is pretty normal information, right? This is basically what we learn about AWS when we first start getting into the domain, right? But as if you're an auditor, you might this might actually be new information. So we talked about security of the cloud in the cloud. AWS has published this information in kind of consolidated into a shared responsibility model, and consider this as a guideline when it comes to assessing the controls in different services. But you should also be aware that there are nuances in this model. Now, for an example, if you take the operating system patching, according to this diagram, yes, it's on the customer side of responsibility, but it also depends on the level of management that AWS has on a particular service. So controls that check if patches are being applied will not be valid for services such as Lambda functions. So you'll have to be aware that there are details in the shared responsibility model. There's a different dimension to this as well. So we'll go into a little bit of detail when we consider a typical control matrix in the next set of slide. But yeah, consider this as a cornerstone in your understanding into the cloud landscape.
And also, some services are only in compliance with certain standards. Like, for example, HIPAA. There's only a subset of our services that are HIPAA compliant. So as part of the architecture, or the architect's job is to go to our documentation, find a list of HIPAA compliant services, and make sure you're only using those. Because obviously, if you use a service that's not HIPAA compliant, then you're not HIPAA compliant.
Yeah, exactly. And there are, of course, the auditors will know better, right? I mean, there are services that makes you HIPAA eligible, and there are services that makes you otherwise. So yeah, it's a good practice to always go deeper into the documentation when possible when considering each service. Right. So I'm trying to talk to the architects in the audience here, the DevOps engineers. So how do we achieve compliance in AWS, and how do we do it in an effective manner? How do we do it? Like Casey said, how do you do it in a reproducible manner, right? Just use AWS config, right? So thanks for coming. That's it. But there's going to be a lot more details in that area, but I can't overstate the importance of AWS config in this exercise. So yes, as a service, it's going to help you a lot, but it's important that you establish a structure to how you manage risks in your solution, how you look at risks in your architecture. So a good model to adopt here is called a 3 lines model. Now this, as I understand, this is a well-established model that comes from what was known as 3-line defense model earlier, and this is a well-established model in the auditing space, and it can be easily adapted into a thinking pattern when we do architecture, when we design architecture as well. Now, 3 lines model is about having a risk-based approach, risk-based view into the solution, and it starts with managing the risks. So you understand the risks your solution will have, the residual risks as well, and then you build mitigations, you build controls around those risks so that you have a baseline standard that you have to adhere to. And then you have the overseeing part of the model where you will have you'll be able to at a point you'll be able to understand the level of compliance your solution has against a certain standard, or you'll understand the amount of work you'll have to do to achieve that compliance. And whenever auditors come around knocking, then then comes the third part of the model where you have to provide assurance to say, yes, I actually am compliant with this standard, or this is the level of work we have to do before we can achieve that compliance. So in ideal conditions, you'll probably start with a risk register of sorts, or you'd probably have a system security plan when you start with a solution. But that's ideal conditions, right? You might not have the entire risk register. So it's important that you build your thinking around this model so that you can keep on adding whenever new risks are identified into your solution. If you have a strategy that you can keep on adding these controls, then it's a matter of identifying risks as you move along the project life cycle, right? So let's talk about establishing a baseline configuration and then managing that configuration. So like I said, a cloud, especially in AWS, things move fast because of the inherent elasticity that you can find in the cloud, right? Decisions are made fast, and implementation is even done faster. You can provision resources quickly, and you can expand your quotas quickly. So it's important that you automate whatever the baseline configuration you have, automate tracking those changes. So there are a few services that you can use when establishing this baseline configuration. So for an example, firewall rules, you can use firewall manager. You can say default deny, default allow, and all of that. You can define a backup strategy across your organization with backup and backup policies. And you can have something like CloudFormation Guard along with CloudFormation to establish a baseline policies that you can enforce. For an example, you can say, S3 bucket policies have whatever the S3 bucket policies that are being created by CloudFormation have to be encrypted by this key, for an example, right? And then systems manager compliance can be used to establish baseline patch levels. And when it comes to identity and access management, you have the service control policies, permission boundaries, and the typical policies that you'd use. And these services, along with some other services, depending on your requirements, will allow you to set up a baseline configuration. And then how you would keep track of this baseline would be using AWS config. So AWS config along with these services will allow you to cover the manage part of the tree lines model. And then when it comes to overseeing, you can then again use AWS config because it also has the visualization aspect as well, right? If you want to move a little step towards the language that compliance speaks, you can use something like Security Hub, which kind of focuses the findings in AWS config towards a framework-based approach. And when it comes to auditing, you can use AWS Audit Manager, which we'll explore in the next few slides. So let's talk about AWS config a little bit, because like I said, I can't overstate the importance AWS config has here. The three value propositions AWS config has are to track changes of the resources and track compliance, and then visualization. You can see that these value propositions actually align with manage and overseeing part of the three lines model. So if you're using AWS config, it's going to make your work in compliance really, really effective, because rather than providing screenshots, hundreds of screenshots for the 100 different S3 buckets you have in your solution, you can just provide a single screenshot of the rule that says S3 buckets should have public access blocked or something like that, and that's going to be backed up by the features that AWS provides. And as an auditor, you should be able to understand that that what you're signing off for is exactly present in the solution. It's been technically verified. And another good feature in AWS config is called conformance packs. Now this is a collection of rules, config rules that you can use to deploy to different accounts in your organization. So you can directly evaluate the level of compliance you have against a certain standard, right? Now, the two standards that I've taken as examples here are New Zealand Information System Security Manual and also CIS benchmark, but there are other well-known standards that have conformance packs in AWS config as well. So it's really easy to build your baseline configuration in AWS config with these conformance specs, and you can augment this with any custom rules you have, for example, based on your requirements, the custom controls that your customer will provide.
That in mind, we've been broadcasting for about 2 to 3 years. The AWS channel has been around for. Well, that's it, and yeah, must be nearly 4. So we've been doing weekly now for at least 2 years. So I hope that answers your question.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Feel free to jump in. Yes. So AWS config. This is just a screenshot of a resource. Now, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that AWS config makes it really easy to do track changes, track compliance, and also do some root cause analysis in the service itself. So for an example, the EBS volume here, you can see that the changes that have been done to the configuration, and if you scroll, if you scroll down here, you can even see the point that it went out of compliance and the change that caused it to go out of compliance. So so like I said, this is a really good service to make use of, and as an auditor, you should be aware that these services exist, and if you're getting evidence from this service, it's much more better than getting a sample of evidence from a list of resources.
And much more importantly, it stops arguments internally about he should, they said, etc., etc.
Right. So let me give you an authentic audit experience, right? So let me take you through real quickly, I promise, through a well-known standard of controls. Now, this standard that I'm going to use is called Cloud Security Alliance Cloud Control Matrix. And as I understand, the control domains included in this standard is pretty much common to any other level of compliance you would work with, especially in the cloud. So let's see what kind of AWS services will be involved here. So as an architect, you'll understand the work you'll have to do, and as an auditor, you'll understand what kind of questions you'll have to ask, or even how to formulate those questions, right? So CSS ECM has 17 control domains, and I'm not going to take you through all 17 just because it's going to take a lot of time, and that's not my goal. And I mean, yes, we know this is an exciting topic, but I'm not trying to go make you fall asleep. But there's another reason. A lot of these controls listed in the control domains are about process controls as well. So I'm not going to focus on process controls. I'm just going to focus on the technical controls most of the time. Right, let's jump in. Again, I promise there'll be no spreadsheets, but here are some slides, right? Audit and assurance, easy one. For security of the cloud, just refer to AWS Artifact. And if you have any questions on the cloud service customer side of things, then you'll have to defer to organization-specific processes. Business continuity and operational resilience. Now, operational resilience is a part of the well-architected framework as well. So it's really easy to answer here. You just have to provide the architectural decisions you have taken on capacity, auto-scaling policies, or the architectural decisions around using serverless as well. So as an auditor, you'll probably need to understand that features such as auto-scaling policies guarantee operational resilience aspects in certain services. And you'll also have to understand the level of management that AWS as the cloud service provider provides in architecture patterns such as serverless. When it comes to data backup, you'll have to check for existence of backup policies, as well as successful execution of those backup plans as well, because just because the backup plans exist doesn't really mean that data is being backed up. Data is being, for an example, copied over to a cross-account vault. So you'll have to check for evidence that says, okay, backup jobs are actually getting successfully executed. And let's jump into the next domain: change control and config management. Again, easy one. AWS Artifact will help you provide assurance for CSP side of things. And when it comes to configuration management and change control, for the CSC side of things, you'll use IAM policies, permission boundaries, and all of these features provided by identity management services in AWS. And how you would manage the configuration, it would be with AWS config and services such as systems manager compliance that we discussed in establishing a baseline configuration for control. Cryptography, encryption, and key management, really exciting domain, but it's always going to be end up in key management service, AWS KMS. Now, as an auditor, it's important that you understand that certain standards will enforce using custom master key, for an example, for encryption work. So just because KMS is being used doesn't mean that the solution, the controls related to that area are being checked off. You should have an understanding about different types of encryption, different types of key policies, key policy features offered by these types of keys. And now Casey made a really good point about default encryption in services. Depending on now, most services offered by AWS will have default encryption, but depending on the time those services were first used in certain, especially in older accounts, there will be certain configurations related to encryption that might not be updated, because cloud is immensely complex, especially when it comes to multi-tenant clouds. So it's important that you actually check that certain default configuration is enabled in these services, even though the documentation says default encryption is enabled for those services. Data center security, one line, AWS Artifact, because this is entirely cloud service provider side of the responsibility matrix. Governance and risk compliance, again, it falls, the CSP side falls into AWS Artifact. It's a common service. But for CSC side of things, if you perform a cloud risk assessment, you'll probably be focusing on this control domain a lot, because these are the areas that a government might be asking you to focus, especially if you're a government agency. Security incident management and cloud forensics. Now, you'll always integrate with another SIEM solution that your organization or your client organization will have. But as an architect, you'll understand that there are a few key points that you can integrate with a SIEM solution: CloudWatch, CloudTrail being the immutable audit trail, and the network logs produced by different services such as transit gateway, network firewall, and all of that. And AWS did introduce Security Lake recently, but it'll have to be a few months before Security Lake is fully supported by different SIEM solutions. I have seen SIEM solutions that support Security Lake, but there seems to be kind of a disconnect still. But it's an exciting service, because it allows you to kind of have this single point where you can have an integration and just continue feeding data into a single point, and then you'll probably save some cost when it comes to data retention in SIEM side as well.
I believe we have done a talk on Security Lake in the past. I'm going to go see if I can go find it while you keep talking.
Yeah, that'd be great. It's a really good service that I found. Unfortunately, the SIEM that I'm working at the moment, it doesn't directly support Security Lake, which would have made my life really easy. Right, supply chain management, transparency, accountability. Again, CSP, AWS Artifact, but on the CSC side, as a customer, if you're building custom software, you probably have to worry about supply chain cleanliness, basically. So you could probably have tools that For an example, you could generate a software bill of materials for this software that you build, and then have let's say this PDX output of that material being analyzed by a third-party solution based on AWS Marketplace. Or you could keep on feeding that to another SIEM based solution that will detect issues in your dependency tree. So these are the areas that we'll have to probably be worried about. Um, Threat and vulnerability management. Now, AWS does provide a lot of services that manage vulnerability detection, but I've found that Amazon Inspector can cover a lot of your use cases, especially if your workloads are focused around container registry based on ECR, Lambda functions, and EC2 instances. Now, as an auditor, there'll be a lot of questions that you'll have to ask about managing threat intelligence sources. But just be aware that most of these services, such as Guard Duty, Amazon Inspector, they don't have any component that allows the customer to manage the threat intelligence sources manually. These are updated in the background in the AWS side of things. So most of the time, I'm just going to say it's the cloud, so deal with it. So threat intelligence is going to be dealt by AWS most of the time. Next domain is infrastructure and virtualization security. Really exciting one as well. But this is especially a domain that you'll have to be aware of when it comes to those little details in the shared responsibility model. Now, that example I took really goes here. Now, you can't really be asking questions. I mean, you can ask the questions, but you'll not get any effective answer about patch management in Lambda functions, right? So this especially get confusing because if for an example, if you have an ECS cluster based on EC2, then yeah, of course you should have controls that validate patch management in EC2 instances. But then if you have the EC2 clusters that are based on Fargate, then that's a whole different set of issues, right? There are controls around capacity planning. Now this is a kind of a contentious point because developers or engineers will almost always say it's the cloud, right? Deal with it. It's going to be elastic anyways. This is true. There's auto scaling in the cloud. There's enough elasticity in the cloud, and cloud providers like AWS always provide enough redundancy so that enough capacity that you can keep on adding services as long as your bill allows that. But then, depending on the project requirements, there'll always be requirements to have some kind of provision capacity as well. So as an auditor, you should be aware that there are features that allow you to have this provision capacity ready to go. So if you're aware that the requirements have the need to have provision capacity, then you should be looking for evidence for those as well. Another interesting topic is separation of prod and non-prod environments. Now, services such as Control Tower and AWS organizations allow you to do this, and then based on that, you can build the access management model based on service control policies, permission boundaries, and the associated features. It's another I guess experience I have is that it's important that you have this separation from the get-go when you define the path to production, because if you try to introduce this later in the project, you'll have all sorts of questions, especially from the developers, because they are used to have administrative access to the production accounts, right? So it's really important that you establish these good practices from the start of the project, because you should be estimating that the control questions are going to be on this area as well. And then bucket policies can help if there are requirements that prevent you from copying production data over to non-production environments. Developers will always try to do this. It's good test data, right? So if you have well-established bucket policies, yes, this will be achieved. And as auditors, you probably need to be aware that features such as bucket policies are backed up by AWS as a feature, so you don't really need to depend on process controls anymore to prevent these things from happening. So you'll be looking for evidence for existence of policies, not evidence for existence of manual approval boards, for an example. Application and interface security. Now, this is the most exciting part for me as a developer. So, yeah, I mean, requirements such as having a defined software development lifecycle. This is this is just good practice, right? If you don't have, if you haven't defined how you do software development, how you deliver software, the software that you develop, you should probably start doing that. But to augment this, it's important that you have a release strategy defined, and you have defined how to roll out your changes into your production environments. In AWS, features such as tag policies can help to define the borders that you have, the different areas that you have, and also do some resource management effectively. And again, preventative and detective guardrails. Now, this is the first time I'm mentioning preventative and detective guardrails. Now, it's again, like I said, it's an AWS config construct that is being used by Control Tower to define a baseline set of controls, right? And talking about static and dynamic security testing, now the controls here will be looking for evidence for of you doing enough testing before changes are being rolled out. So we can talk about shift left strategies here. So things like Code Guru can help you identify issues in your code earlier in your pipeline before you start pushing your code even into dev environments, or you could even use other static analysis tools that are specific to your programming language as well. When it comes to infrastructure as code, it could be something like CloudFormation Guard, or if you're using something like Terraform, it could be a service like Checkov. And DDoS protection, the controls around these can be just checked off by the presence of Shield, or if needed, Shield Advanced. And secure application deployment would be a collection of the features provided by KMS, access management features, and just good infrastructure as code practices. Right. Data security, privacy. Now, there's nothing I can add here that the engineers don't already know. But one thing that I want to point out here is having a data classification system for your solution, because that will directly be influential to you how you do encryption of your data across your solution, because the number of keys you would start from will probably be mapping to the classification you already have. So it's the controls around this control domain look for an existence of data classification system, and if you don't have one, you'll probably fail this control domain. Identity and access management, another easy one. Just point out to all the identity management services that I've used in AWS. So it'll be IAM, AWS Cognito, or even AWS IAM Identity Center, which used to be called AWS SSO. One thing to focus here is that controls will be looking for evidence of implementation of least privilege, and this is really easy to achieve if you start from the beginning. If you just hand out AWS administrator access role to everyone, yeah, probably not a good place to start. But even with that state, you can use features such as access analyzer to start reducing the level of access you have already granted. You can also start from the job function related AWS managed policies and start adding or removing policies as you go along. So that's a good place to start. And while AWS IAM supports password policies, multi-factor authentication, and also generating credential usage reports, if your organization or the organization that you're building a solution for has a centralized user store, such as an Active Directory, it might actually be better to use federated authentication, even though you have to invest some time on setting these up. And AWS services that support federated authentication really does a good job making it easier to do this integration. So for an example, you could have access to AWS console, access to your application source hosted on AWS, and also other services such as AppStream federated by the client's Active Directory as a user store. This makes it easier to just defer any questions on the controls such as password rotation, password management policies, enforcement of multi-factor authentication, or even things like user onboarding and offboarding to your IT operations team and just be done with it, because that's not on you to provide evidence for existence of that. Everything is managed by the central AD. Now, another key point I want to raise here is the existence of the root user in AWS. I found that this has always managed to confuse the auditors because, yeah, IAM implements these cool features that allow you to do least privilege, allows you to have different users. But why is there a super admin user that can be reused by that can be used by any user without leaving a trail, right? And the questions I've been asked have been, hey, can this be federated away? Can this be disabled? Unfortunately, no, that can't be done. A root user is going to be in a given AWS organization. You just have to deal with that. So by deal with it, I mean, you'll probably have to raise exemptions for your process and have your controls validate the existence of other processes that augment the use of the root user. So that might mean, for an example, generating a paper trail whenever a root user is used, so that that paper trail describes which actual user had access to the root user. And there could be technical controls, activities that say, for an example, raise an alarm whenever the root user is used in a given organization. So yeah, this is an interesting case that I found when working with auditors, again, because this is a new, I guess, kind of a new concept when it comes to the cloud. So yeah.
On that note, the only thing that trumps a root user is a service control policy. So you
Right.
can, but you still will always have to deal with the root user of the root account of your organization.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, that has been. I mean, I've been asked that question a few times. Why is there a root user? Why can't you, move that away? So yeah. So people in information security and compliance, it's important to understand that you know this is a reality you'll have to work with, but there are other controls that can minimize the root of the root user. Logging and monitoring. Easy one, CloudWatch, CloudTrail. I mean, as engineers, you know this, and it's really easy to provide evidence for this as well. All these services have alerting, anomaly detection, and all of that good stuff. A really cool service I found during the research I wanted to just discuss was AWS Time Sync. Now, it's important that you have all the service sources that publish logs to CloudWatch have the time synchronized, because you know that's just basic sense, right? You have to have your events in order to do post hoc investigations, right? So Amazon Time Sync is a public service, an NTP service that you can use to synchronize time. So it's even publicly available as of 2022, I think. So it's a really good service. If you're an engineer, just check it out. You don't really have to deploy your own time sync servers anymore.
this is the first time I actually ever heard of the fact that we have a time sync service. So
Yeah, I
learn
just
new
did a
things every day.
search. Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, my thinking was, hey, this is a really common service. Why doesn't AWS have this already? Oh, it has. Right. Thanks. uh, so, have I managed to put everyone to sleep already, or I mean, how is it going now? I think if the fact that questions are pouring in probably means that I've not been putting you to sleep. But in any case, this is the level of for an engineer, these services are not new to you, but for an auditor, this is probably the level of engagement you'll have to have with the engineering team to get the evidence out of them when you're doing an audit. And if you're an auditor who's worked with me in the past, and if you're wondering why I haven't done any of those things, just do as I say, not as I do. I'm just quoting my technical lead. Right. So let's check how we can do compliance actually in a better way in the cloud. I mean, age of spreadsheets, it's not over. I'm being a little bit over ambitious here. It's going to be there for the next 20 years, but I'm going to see if I can make a dent on that outcome. So introducing AWS Audit Manager, right? I mean, this is not nearly a new service. It has been there for a few years, but now we talked about establishing a baseline set of controls and having the single pane of glass view. But when it comes to services such as AWS Config or even Security Hub, there is still a disconnect between the language these services speak, the outputs these services provide, and the language the auditors will speak. Because if you're trying to map, for an example, the findings from Security Hub, you still have to do some manual work to map those into the control domains that we just discussed. If you're using, CCM in your solution, right? So, Audit Manager is a solution that bridges this gap. Now, AWS config is focused around the resources and having the rules around the resources, and Security Hub is more about a specific framework. And AWS Audit Manager will be around specific standards. So you can directly generate an output that says, for this standard, these control domains are compliant up to this level. And you can even drill down into specific controls defined by those standards. So Audit Manager provides a really good built-in library of frameworks. So if you're looking for compliance for, let's say, PCI DSS or SOC 2, Audit Manager has that capability. You just need to enable Audit Manager, go and add SOC 2, for an example, to your evaluation assessment, and that's it. And within, I believe it's 24 hours to do the evaluation. Within 24 hours, you will have a comprehensive report of the level of compliance you have with a language that information security and compliance will speak. So as an engineer, you'll probably have to do minimal work translating that into a comprehensive audit report. And always you'll have to develop some custom frameworks on top of this, so you can define custom controls, and you also have like some role separation. So you could follow a pattern where you can have audit management be done in the audit account deployed by the control tower, and then give access to the auditors directly to the audit account and have them generate the reports as they go through the audit effort. So if I knew about this at least 6 months ago, it would have actually saved me at least a week of calls that I had to take to provide evidence for the auditors. So this is a really cool service I wanted to share with you. So if you're an engineer, consider using this. If you're an auditor, consider using an Audit Manager as well, because it gives you the output that you might be probably looking for. So this is the dashboard you'll see when you when you enable Audit Manager. It uses AWS Config and Security Hub as main sources, but it also uses CloudTrail to check off certain controls as well. So you can see at a glance, this is basically the oversee aspect of the 3 lines model that we talked about, right? At a glance, you can see the level of compliance you have, and it speaks in control domain in audit language. And you can enable, disable certain parts of a framework. You can have a customized framework based on the combination of compliance you need to have. And then you can generate a report that you can provide to the auditors. And yes, it makes the life of an engineer easy. And as an auditor, it actually helps you do auditing better as well, because now this is a real life example I'm going to make, and don't relate it to any. If you have worked with me, don't relate it to anything that I've done in the past. But for an example, there could be a case where you have to check for encryption of S3 buckets, right? And if I have hundreds of S3 buckets in my solution, you're not probably interested in hundreds of screenshots. You'll need a sample of screenshots, but that doesn't necessarily mean all of these 3 buckets have been encrypted by default. And yes, having a screenshot of the config rule might help, but only if you know enough config to understand the level of compliance. But a technically generated report like this will probably help you understand in detail what you're actually signing off, because you will see what kind of resources that are non-compliant, and if those resources are actually in the production environment, say if only the production environment is eligible to be evaluated for compliance. So this is a really good tool. I can't again overstate how cool it is.
Are you able to export the reports to PDF? Or am
Yes,
I?
exactly. Yeah, you can export to PDF. I haven't really checked if you can export it to a CSV or an Excel format. So I'm guessing you'll probably have to fill the spreadsheet yourself again. Sorry, I'm just making a lot of auditors angry. But yeah, it's PDF that I that I found. Um, Right. So as I said, a lot of services that we talked about already are, if you're an engineer, you are already aware of this. But if you're an auditor, I basically told you to get good, right? The whole entire point of the talk was to get good at AWS, right? But how do you actually do that? How do you, if you're coming from an audit background, if you're coming from information security, or even, not even from information security, just, compliance in general, how do you build competencies so that you can actually do an effective audit on an AWS solution? I wanted to kind of touch that point as well. Now, the first resource I thought about was, cloud practitioner exam qualification. But, thinking about this more, it might not be the best approach for you, especially because, I mean, yes, it is a stepping stone into the AWS qualification ecosystem, but it might probably uh, be a little bit more on general cloud concepts and AWS related concepts rather than compliance itself. Another really good source that you can use here is AWS Audit Academy. Now, this is a learning path provided by AWS Training. But the best thing about AWS Audit Academy is it's geared towards individuals like auditors, compliance officers, and other information system compliance people in general. And the resources in Audit Academy are generated by auditors that have already worked with AWS, and you're basically learning from experience from auditors that have done this work before. So there are three streams that you can take. You can, if you're a total newbie into the ecosystem, you can take that stream. There is a stream that focuses on AWS specific parts when it comes to doing compliance, and then I believe there's a stream that allows you to focus on different business domains as well: healthcare, financial sector, government, like that. So this is a really good learning path to check out. It's instructor led, so talk to your budget person, see if you have see if you can get that training scheduled. Or if you're trying to just get through a compliance effort, there are a lot of public AWS resources that are basically guidelines on how to implement a certain standard. Now, from my own experience, I've gone through the New Zealand Information Security Manual guidelines, so that allows you to have an understanding of which services are to be followed when you are trying to stick to these standards. Right. Let's do a quick recap. So we considered a risk-based approach to architecting as engineers. So a good model to base that is on the 3 lines model. So I hope this kind of leaves something in your mind whenever you approach your next solution. Have this risk-based approach in mind, so that you always have a strategy to keep on adding features so that you can be compliant whenever you're asked to. We went through a sample control framework, really fun work, I understand. We checked out the services that can be used, and also for the other side of the aisle, the auditors, we discussed the nuances in the shared responsibility model. One good point I think I wanted to make here is that now this is a real question I've been asked for a solution that we worked on for more than 12 months. I was asked whether we implement defense in depth. Now, yes, the question is valid, but it's also kind of invalid for that context, because the only question, the answer I can give you there is yes, but that probably doesn't check off any controls you have on that area, because you probably need to refocus that question on a specific component or on a specific service. Or if that doesn't make it clear, you'll probably have to refer to the control implementation or the control auditing guidelines provided by the standard. So in general, just be specific on the questions, because principles like defense in depth, least privilege, they can be really broad when it comes to them being implemented in the cloud. And we then checked out briefly on how to do compliance with AWS. Check out Audit Manager. It's a really cool feature. I'm definitely going to use that in the future.
Chamila, before you progress, we have a question from someone you definitely don't know. So Chris McKinnell has asked, can you integrate Audit Manager with other solutions to get continuous compliance type reporting instead of every 12 months, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't, by the way, glad to see you, Chris. I couldn't check the API support in Audit Manager, but I'm pretty sure it can be done. Another way I would do this is to just provide access to the auditors if they are at least if they have the skills to actually generate this. But another way would be to just have a standard operation procedure or documentation around generating documents, right? But yeah, that's a good thing to look into.
Cool. Awesome. We are running a bit over time, but that's fine because luckily we don't have anyone coming after us. But yeah, if you do have any questions for Chamila here, do ask them now. And thank you so much from the awesome people at Livin and also Chamila yourself to giving this talk and sharing your knowledge with us. I do want to say one quick thing. A few weeks or months ago now, we ran a series or a 5-part series called How to Become a Network Ninja. I am wanting to run a similar thing either towards the end of this year or the beginning of next year, deep diving into a topic of your choice. So if you do want to, join us and have influence what we want to deep dive into, we do have a AWS New Zealand Technical Community LinkedIn group that you can join, and yeah, just put any of your thoughts into that. I am leaning towards analytics, or maybe even doing a deep dive into modern data warehousing, getting into the nitty-gritty of Redshift. But I want to do something that you as the audience find interesting, so I do very much want you to either post in the chat here or just join that LinkedIn group and make a post there about what you are wanting to hear from us. But yes, thank you very much, Chamila, for coming on and sharing your knowledge about compliance. It has been a very educational talk. It's been awesome.
Thank you, Casey, for having me.
No problem. And with that, I don't see anything popping through, so I will say matiwa for everyone and enjoy your weekend.